The centuries roll backward. The empire breathes again. The cold wind sweeps down from the Pierian mountains, carrying with it the scent of pine and wood smoke across a highland plain where shepherds once guided their flocks beneath skies that would one day witness the birth of conquerors. This is Macedonia, not the polished marble world of Athens or Sparta, but something rawer, something forged in stone and struggle, where a kingdom dismissed as half-barbarian by the city-states to the south would rise to reshape every corner of the known world. The light falls across limestone walls and ancient foundations, the remnants of Aigai, the first royal capital, where the Argead dynasty claimed descent from Heracles himself. Here, in tombs sealed for over 2,000 years, archaeologists would one day uncover golden larnacies bearing the starburst of Macedonian royalty, oak wreath crowns of hammered gold, painted frescoes of royal hunts so vivid they seem to breathe. But that discovery lies far in the future. For now the story begins with tribal chieftains and contested borders, with Illyrian raids and Thracian incursions, with kings who fought simply to survive. This is where a complete journey begins. From those earliest pastoral settlements around 700 years before Christ, through the revolutionary genius of Philip II, who invented a new kind of warfare with the 6-meter sarissa pike and the thunderous companion cavalry, to his son Alexander, who in just 11 years of relentless campaigning carried Macedonian arms from the Granicus River to the banks of the Indus, founding cities, toppling the mighty Achaemenid Persian Empire, and building the largest dominion the Western world had ever seen. But this story does not end with Alexander's death in Babylon at the age of 32. It continues through the savage wars of his successors, the Diadochi, who carved his empire into rival kingdoms. It follows the rise of Ptolemaic Egypt, the Seleucid dynasty across the Near East, and the Antigonids who held Macedonia itself. It traces the extraordinary Hellenistic civilization that flourished for nearly 3 centuries, a world where Greek philosophy met Eastern tradition, where Euclid composed his Elements and Eratosthenes measured the circumference of the earth, where the great library of Alexandria became a beacon for human knowledge. And it follows this world to its end, when Roman legions marched east and the phalanx fell for the last time at the Battle of Pydna, when Macedonia became a province, and when the last Hellenistic queen, Cleopatra, drew her final breath in Alexandria. The language Alexander's soldiers carried across 3 continents became the tongue of the New Testament. The cities his successors built became crucibles of science, art, and philosophy that shaped Islamic scholarship and the European Renaissance. The very idea that one ruler might govern many peoples, many cultures, under a single vision passed from Macedonia through Rome and into the political imagination of the modern world. This is not merely a history lesson. This is the complete arc of a civilization, from mountain shepherds to masters of the world, from golden tomb offerings at Vergina to the pebble mosaics of Pella depicting Dionysus riding his leopard. Every battle, every reform, every cultural transformation will unfold in its proper place, told through the stones, the artifacts, and the landscapes that still hold the memory of what once was. Some of the greatest mysteries of human achievement lie embedded in this story. How did a peripheral kingdom overcome every obstacle to conquer an empire of 50 million souls? What drove Alexander beyond the edges of every map? And how did a civilization, shattered by his death, leave a legacy that still echoes in the languages spoken, the books written, and the cities inhabited today? If these complete journeys through ancient civilizations speak to something deep within, please subscribe so that no chapter of the ancient world passes unwitnessed. Each week, the full story of a lost world returns to light. Now let us begin our journey in the rugged highlands where cold winds cross fertile plains, where a dynasty rises from myth, and where the first sons of the mountains take their place in history. Mist clings to the Pierian mountains at dawn. The peaks rise sharp and dark against a pale sky, their limestone ridges scarred by winter storms, their lower slopes thick with oak and beech forest that gives way, higher up, to alpine meadow and bare rock. Cold streams cut through narrow valleys, feeding the broad plains below, where the Haliakmon and Axios rivers wind slowly towards the Thermaic Gulf. This is the land that will one day shake the ancient world to its foundations. But for now it is quiet, remote, and almost forgotten. Sometime around 700 years before the Common Era, a people begin to coalesce in these highlands. They speak a dialect of Greek, rough and archaic to southern ears, and they live as herders and farmers, moving their flocks between summer pastures and winter lowlands. Their settlements are modest, timber-framed houses with stone foundations clustered on defensible hillsides. Bronze weapons and simple painted pottery fill their graves. They are surrounded on every side by hostile neighbors, Illyrians pressing from the northwest, Paeonians from the north, Thracians from the east. Survival here demands vigilance and a willingness to fight. The ruling clan calls itself the Argeads, and their origin story reaches deep into myth. They claim descent from Temenus of Argos, a Heraclid, tracing their bloodline back to Heracles himself. According to the tradition preserved by Herodotus, 3 brothers, Goanes, Eropus, and Perdiccas, flee Argos and find service with a highland king. When they are driven out, the sun itself validates their destiny. Perdiccas the youngest becomes the first king. Whether history or invention, this genealogy serves a vital purpose. It binds the Macedonian royal house to the Greek heroic past and provides legitimacy in a world where lineage is power. Perdiccas and his successors established their capital at Aigai, nestled against the foothills where the mountains meet the Emathian plain. The site is strategic, elevated enough for defense, close enough to fertile lowland for agriculture. The earliest royal burial mounds here contain bronze vessels, iron swords, and gold ornaments of restrained craftsmanship, evidence of a warrior aristocracy that values martial prowess above all else. The kings of Aigai rule not by absolute authority, but through the loyalty of fractious noble clans, each commanding their own armed retainers. Holding this kingdom together requires as much cunning as courage. For 2 centuries the Argeads endure, expanding slowly, absorbing neighboring tribes, losing ground, recovering it. The wider Greek world barely notices. To Athenians and Spartans, Macedonia is a backwater, its people semi-barbarian despite their Greek tongue. But the world intrudes nonetheless. In 480 before the Common Era, the vast army of Xerxes I of Persia marches through Macedonia on its way to invade Greece. The Macedonian king, Alexander I, has no choice but to submit and provide passage. He becomes a Persian vassal, supplying timber and troops. Yet Alexander I plays a double game of extraordinary delicacy. While publicly serving Persia, he secretly sends intelligence to the Greek allies, before the Battle of Plataea. After the Persian defeat, he expands Macedonian territory eastward into lands the retreating empire abandons. He courts the Greek world with equal care, competing at the Olympic Games at Olympia, where participation requires proof of Greek heritage. The Hellenodici, the judges, accept his Argead pedigree. He earns the epithet Philhellene, friend of the Greeks, a title that is both honor and quiet acknowledgement that his kingdom still stands at the margins of the Hellenic world. The highland plains around Aigai still hold their flocks. Bronze spearheads still gleam in burial earth. The Argead dynasty endures through assassination, invasion, and the slow, grinding pressure of hostile borders. Nothing about this small pastoral kingdom suggests the storm that is gathering in its bloodline, the transformation that will come within a few generations. For now, Macedonia waits in its mountains, watching the passes, tending its herds, burying its kings with weapons in their hands. The lowland plain stretches flat and wide beneath a sky heavy with summer heat. Reeds line the marshes where the Lodius River spreads into shallow lakes, and beyond them, rising on a low plateau above the wetlands, the new capital takes shape. Pella emerges in the late 5th century before the Common Era as something Macedonia has never possessed, a city built not for defense alone, but for display, for ambition, for the projection of royal power across the Greek world. Archelaus, who seizes the throne around 413 before the Common Era after eliminating rival claimants with methodical violence, understands that a kingdom perceived as backward will remain vulnerable. He transfers the seat of power from the mountain stronghold of Aigai to this accessible lowland site, connected by waterways to the Thermaic Gulf and the trade routes of the Aegean. He commissions roads, proper military roads cut through forest and hill country, linking the interior to the coast. He reorganizes the army, introducing standardized equipment and training that begins to transform tribal levies into something approaching a disciplined force. But Archelaus's most striking ambition is cultural. He invites Euripides, the great Athenian tragedian, to his court. The playwright spends his final years at Pella composing the Bacchae and the Archelaus in these northern halls. The painter Zeuxis, renowned across Greece for his illusionistic technique, decorates the palace walls. Musicians and poets gather where highland chieftains once feasted on roasted meat and unmixed wine. The palace complex itself grows. Colonnaded courtyards open onto rooms where pebble mosaics begin to appear underfoot, their tiny stones arranged in patterns of geometric precision. Archelaus reigns for roughly 14 years. His assassination around 399 before the Common Era, at the hands of royal pages during a hunt, inaugurates a catastrophe. In the 4 decades that follow, Macedonia cycles through kings with devastating speed. Orestes, a minor, is murdered by his guardian Aeropus. Amyntas II holds power briefly before being overthrown. Pausanias seizes the throne, then loses it. Amyntas III, who manages to rule for over 2 decades, faces constant threats. Illyrian invasions drive him from his own kingdom at least once, and he survives only through alliances with Thessaly and the payment of tribute to foreign powers. The palace mosaics at Pella accumulate dust between reigns. The roads Archelaus built carry invading armies as often as Macedonian ones. Athens, Thebes, and the Chalcidian League each intervene in Macedonian succession disputes, backing rival claimants, extracting concessions, treating the kingdom as a client state to be manipulated. The Illyrians press from the west with increasing ferocity. The Paeonians raid from the north. Amyntas III dies around 370 before the Common Era, and the cycle accelerates. His eldest son Alexander II is assassinated within 2 years. His second son Perdiccas III takes power as a young man, spending his reign fighting to hold together a kingdom that seems determined to tear itself apart. He attempts military reforms, rebuilding the army that Archelaus had begun to professionalize. But the resources are thin, and the enemies relentless. In 359 before the Common Era, Perdiccas III marches north to confront the Illyrian king Bardilis, whose forces have been raiding Macedonian territory with impunity. The battle is a disaster. 4,000 Macedonian soldiers die on the field. Perdiccas himself falls among them. The Illyrians occupy the western borderlands. The Paeonians sense weakness and launch their own raids. 2 pretenders to the throne receive backing from foreign powers, one supported by the Thracians, another by the Athenians, who land 3,000 troops on the Macedonian coast. The kingdom that Archelaus had tried to elevate into the Greek cultural world now teeters on the edge of annihilation. Its treasury is empty. Its army is shattered. Its king is dead, leaving an infant son and a kingdom surrounded by enemies who smell blood. The fortification walls of Pella, still unfinished in places, look out over a landscape of approaching threats from every direction. Macedonia's survival now depends entirely on the abilities of a single young man, a 23-year-old prince who has spent 3 years as a hostage in Thebes, watching, learning, and waiting. Philip arrives in Pella in the autumn of 359 before the Common Era, and he arrives with knowledge that no Macedonian king has ever possessed. 3 years as a hostage in Thebes have placed him in the household of Epaminondas, the finest military mind of the age. He has watched the Theban general drill his infantry into the oblique order that shattered Spartan supremacy at Leuctra. He has studied how concentrated force at a single point can break a superior line. He has observed how professional training transforms farmers into soldiers who do not flinch. These lessons now travel north with him, carried in the mind of a young man who understands that Macedonia's survival depends on reinventing everything. The court at Pella is a nest of conspiracy. Philip's infant nephew holds the nominal throne, but real power belongs to whoever can seize it. Philip acts with a speed that stuns his rivals. He secures the loyalty of the Highland barons through a combination of personal charisma and calculated marriages, wedding Phila of Elymiotis to bind the western cantons. He dispatches envoys laden with gold to the Paeonians and Thracians, purchasing temporary peace on 2 frontiers so that he can face the deadliest threat alone. That threat is Bardilis, the aging Illyrian king whose warriors killed Perdiccas and 4,000 Macedonians barely a year before. In the spring of 358, Philip marches west into the Eragon Valley with roughly 10,000 infantry and 600 cavalry. The army he leads is already different from the force that perished under his brother. He has reorganized the infantry into a phalanx formation modeled on Theban principles but adapted with a weapon entirely new to Greek warfare, the sarissa. The sarissa is a cornel wood pike stretching nearly 6 meters in length, fitted with an iron point at one end and a bronze counterweight at the other. It requires 2 hands to wield, which means the soldiers carry smaller shields slung from neck straps rather than gripped on the forearm. In the workshops of Pella, smiths hammer iron billets into leaf-shaped blade points, while woodworkers split and season cornel shafts, joining them with iron sleeves at the center. The weapon is unwieldy for an individual soldier, but devastating in formation. When the first 5 ranks lower their sarissas simultaneously, the phalanx presents a bristling wall of iron points that no opposing infantry can reach before being impaled. The men behind hold their pikes upright, deflecting incoming arrows with the sheer density of wooden shafts. On the floor of the Aragon Valley, Philip deploys this new phalanx against Bardilus's Illyrian warriors. The Illyrians fight in a traditional square formation, relying on close-quarters combat with swords and javelins. Philip refuses to engage evenly across the line. He weights his right wing with his strongest infantry and personally leads the cavalry against the Illyrian flank. The sarissa wall pins the Illyrian front in place, while the cavalry wheels into their exposed side. The formation collapses. 7,000 Illyrians fall on the field. Bardilus sues for peace, surrendering all territory east of Lake Ohrid. In a single afternoon, the threat that nearly destroyed Macedonia is broken. Philip returns to Pella and accelerates his reforms. The plains outside the city become permanent drilling grounds, where infantry units practice wheeling, advancing, and pivoting in formation for months at a time. He establishes a system of royal pages, sons of the nobility brought to court as both honored companions and subtle hostages, ensuring their father's loyalty. He takes additional wives with strategic precision, marrying the Thessalian Philina and the Molossian princess Olympias of Epirus in 357, binding neighboring powers through blood rather than gold. The forges burn day and night. Iron sarissa points accumulate in armory stores. Cavalry mounts are bred larger and stronger on the Amathian plain. Philip drills his companion cavalry to charge in wedge formation, a tactic that concentrates impact at a single penetration point. By 354, the Macedonian military is unrecognizable from the shattered force that lost its king to Illyrian swords just 5 years earlier. What emerges from these plains is not merely a reformed army, but an instrument of conquest. Professional, disciplined, loyal to its king, and armed with weapons and tactics that no opponent in the Greek world has yet encountered. Gold changes everything. Deep in the forested slopes of Mount Pangaion, east of the Strymon River, miners descend into shafts that honeycomb the ancient rock. The veins run thick with ore, gold and silver in quantities that no Greek state has controlled since the Athenian mines at Laurion began their slow decline. Philip seizes these mines after capturing the settlement of Crenides in 356, before the Common Era, refounding it as Philippi, stamping his name upon the land itself. The revenue is staggering. More than 1,000 talents of gold flow into Macedonian coffers each year, a sum that dwarfs the annual income of Athens at its imperial height. With this wealth, Philip does not merely fund an army. He purchases loyalty, bribes foreign politicians, subsidizes allies, and finances a permanent military establishment that never disbands between campaigns. The gold of Pangaion transforms the companion cavalry from a noble retinue into an elite striking force of perhaps 800 horsemen organized into squadrons called Elae, each recruited from a specific region of Macedonia. These riders carry the ziston, a cornel wood lance nearly 4 meters long, designed for a single devastating downward thrust delivered at the gallop. They train relentlessly on the Amathian plain, perfecting the wedge formation that allows a concentrated mass of riders to punch through enemy lines at their weakest point. No Greek city-state maintains anything comparable. The cavalry of Athens and Thebes serves as auxiliary screening forces. Philip's companions are a decisive battlefield weapon. Alongside them, the infantry phalanx matures into a formation of terrifying precision. 6 battalions of foot companions, the Pergetteroi, drill until the 16-deep formation moves as a single organism, the forest of sarissa pikes leveling forward in coordinated waves. Light troops, archers, slingers, and javelin-armed skirmishers fill the gaps. Siege engineers, many recruited from the workshops of Syracuse and the Greek East, design torsion-powered catapults and siege towers that give Philip the capacity to reduce fortified cities, a capability that most Greek commanders simply lack. The results are immediate and relentless. Amphipolis falls in 357. Potidaea follows, its Athenian settlers expelled. Pydna and Methone are taken, and at Methone in 354, Philip loses his right eye to an arrow during the siege, a wound he bears without retreat. He pushes south into Thessaly, defeating the tyrants of Pherae and assuming the archonship of the Thessalian League, which grants him command of Thessaly's superb cavalry and a seat at the Amphictyonic Council that governs the sanctuary at Delphi. The sacred war over control of Delphi provides the opening Philip needs to project power deep into central Greece. When the Phocians seize Delphi's treasury to fund mercenary armies, Philip intervenes as the champion of the god Apollo. His victory at the Battle of the Crocus Field in 352 destroys the Phocian army and establishes Macedonian influence south of Thermopylae for the first time. Yet it is the fate of Olynthus that sends the sharpest tremor through the Greek world. The leading city of the Chalcidian League, Olynthus had allied with Athens against Macedonian expansion. Demosthenes delivers his Olynthiac orations in Athens, urging military aid. The aid arrives too late. In 348, Philip's army breaches the walls. The city is razed to the ground, its population enslaved, its houses left as rubble that archaeologists would one day excavate to reveal frozen moments of daily life, cooking pots still on hearths, coins scattered across mosaic floors. The destruction of Olynthus demonstrates that Philip wields not merely an army, but a system: logistics, intelligence, diplomacy, bribery, and overwhelming force coordinated with a patience and strategic vision unprecedented in Greek warfare. By 346, when the Peace of Philocrates ends hostilities between Macedonia and Athens, Philip controls the Thermopylae Pass, dominates the Amphictyonic Council, and commands revenues, territories, and military forces that no single Greek power can match. The professional army born on the plains of Pella has become the most formidable military instrument in the Mediterranean world, and its architect is not yet finished. The orator's voice carries across the Athenian assembly like a blade drawn from its sheath. Demosthenes, son of a wealthy sword-maker ruined by dishonest guardians, has spent years sharpening his rhetoric against the Macedonian threat. His Philippic orations, delivered between 344 and 341 before the Common Era, paint Philip as a barbarian tyrant devouring Greek liberty city by city. The words are brilliant, passionate, and ultimately insufficient. While Athens debates, Philip acts. The crisis accelerates through the Fourth Sacred War. When the city of Amphissa illegally cultivates sacred land near Delphi, the Amphictyonic Council invites Philip to intervene. He marches south in 339, but instead of striking Amphissa directly, he seizes and fortifies the town of Elatea, commanding the road into central Greece. The news reaches Athens at nightfall. Demosthenes, in his finest political hour, forges an alliance with Thebes, Athens's traditional rival, against the common Macedonian threat. The two armies meet on the plain of Chaeronea in Boeotia on the 2nd of August, 338 before the Common Era. The allied Greek force numbers approximately 35,000 Mars, Athenian hoplites on the left, Thebans on the right, with the elite sacred band of Thebes holding the extreme right flank. Philip commands roughly 30,000 Macedonians and allied troops. He takes the right wing himself, opposite the Athenians. His 18-year-old son Alexander commands the left, leading the companion cavalry opposite the Thebans. The battle unfolds with calculated precision. Philip's right wing feigns a slow withdrawal, drawing the inexperienced Athenian hoplites forward and opening a gap in the allied line. Alexander, watching from the left, launches the companion cavalry into that gap with devastating timing. The sacred band of Thebes, 300 paired warriors who have never known defeat in battle, refuses to retreat. They die where they stand. Every single member falls, killed or mortally wounded. A stone lion monument, still standing at Chaeronea today, marks the place where their bodies are recovered. 1,000 Athenians die on the field. 2,000 more are captured. The allied army shatters. Greece's last organized military resistance to Macedonian power ends in a single afternoon on a Boeotian plain. Philip's settlement proves shrewder than any conquest by force alone. He treats Athens with calculated generosity, returning prisoners without ransom, sending Alexander to escort the Athenian dead home. Thebes receives harsher terms. A Macedonian garrison occupies the Cadmea, its ancient citadel. In the winter of 337, Philip convenes delegates from nearly every Greek state at Corinth. The resulting League of Corinth establishes a common peace, a permanent alliance with Macedonia, and a joint military command for a declared war against the Persian Empire. Philip is elected hegemon, supreme commander. Every member state pledges troops. Only Sparta refuses to join, and Philip leaves it isolated but unpunished. The theatre at Aigai, the ancient Argead capital, fills with guests in October of 336 before the Common Era. Philip's daughter Cleopatra marries Alexander of Epirus in a ceremony designed to display Macedonian magnificence to the Greek world. Statues of the 12 Olympian gods process into the theatre at dawn, and alongside them a 13th statue, Philip himself, seated among the immortals. As Philip enters the theatre unguarded, walking between his son Alexander and his new son-in-law, his bodyguard Pausanias of Orestis steps forward and drives a Celtic dagger beneath Philip's ribs. The king collapses. Pausanias runs toward waiting horses at the city gate, but catches his foot in a vine and falls. Pursuing companions kill him on the spot. Philip dies at 46, having transformed a failing tribal kingdom into the dominant military power of the Mediterranean world. His body is cremated on a pyre of extraordinary richness. The bones, washed in wine and wrapped in purple cloth, are placed inside a golden larnax weighing 11 kilograms, its lid embossed with the 16-pointed vagina star. A golden oak wreath crown of exquisite craftsmanship, 313 leaves and 68 acorns, rests atop the remains. The larnax is sealed within a marble sarcophagus and lowered into a vaulted tomb beneath a great tumulus at Vergina, where it will remain undisturbed for 23 centuries until Manolis Andronikos opens it in 1977. The kingdom passes to Alexander, who inherits the finest army in the known world and a plan to invade Persia. Alexander is 20 years old. The throne he inherits is soaked in his father's blood, and the empire Philip built trembles at its edges. Rivals within the Argead bloodline see opportunity in the chaos. Pretenders and conspirators move in the shadows of Pella's corridors, testing whether this young king possesses the will to hold what his father forged. He does. Within weeks, Alexander eliminates potential claimants to the throne, Attalus, his father's uncle by marriage, and a powerful general commanding the advance force already in Asia Minor, is assassinated on Alexander's orders. Amyntas, a cousin with a legitimate claim, is executed. The purge is swift, surgical, and complete. But the greater danger lies beyond Macedonia's borders. The Greek city-states, bound to Philip by the League of Corinth, see the assassination as liberation. Thebes stirs. Athens celebrates. Demosthenes reportedly appears in the assembly wearing a garland of flowers despite being in mourning for his own daughter. So great is his joy at Philip's death. The fragile unity of Greece threatens to shatter before Alexander can even secure his own court. He moves south with terrifying speed. Before the Greek states can organize resistance, Alexander marches the Macedonian army through Thessaly, past Thermopylae, and into central Greece. The show of force is enough. The League of Corinth reconvenes and confirms Alexander as hegemon, supreme commander of the planned Persian campaign. He is his father's successor in title and in authority. Then he turns north. In the spring of 335, before the Common Era, Alexander launches a campaign against the Triballi and other restless peoples along Macedonia's northern frontier. He crosses the Haemus Range, defeats the Triballi in a sharp engagement, and pushes all the way to the Danube. The army crosses the great river in a single night, using stuffed leather tent covers as improvised rafts and hollowed-out log canoes. The Getae on the far bank scatter before the Macedonian infantry materializes at dawn on their shore. The crossing is a statement of intent. No natural barrier will contain this king. Word reaches Alexander during the Illyrian campaign that Thebes has revolted. A false rumor of Alexander's death in the north has emboldened the Thebans to expel the Macedonian garrison from the Cadmea, the citadel overlooking the city. Demosthenes has sent weapons. Persian gold flows into the rebels' hands. Alexander covers the distance from Illyria to Thebes in 13 days, a march of nearly 400 kilometers that stuns the Greek world. The Thebans do not believe the reports until the Macedonian army appears before their walls. The assault is ferocious. Perdiccas leads a breakthrough at a postern gate. The phalanx pours through. Street by street, the city falls. 6,000 Thebans die in the fighting. The survivors, 30,000 men, women, and children, are sold into slavery. Alexander orders Thebes razed to the ground, its walls demolished, its buildings reduced to rubble. Only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar are spared, a calculated gesture of cultural reverence amid total destruction. The message reverberates across Greece like a seismic tremor. Athens sends an embassy begging forgiveness. Every city-state submits. The Greek world falls silent. At Pella, preparations for the Persian invasion accelerate through the winter months. Alexander assembles an expeditionary force of approximately 37,000 soldiers, 12,000 Macedonian infantry forming the core phalanx, 1,800 companion cavalry, Thessalian horsemen, allied Greek infantry, Thracian javelin throwers, Cretan archers, and specialist engineers. 160 warships will carry them across the Hellespont. The army carries with it a scientific staff, geographers, botanists, historians, reflecting the education Alexander received years earlier at Mieza under Aristotle, where the philosopher taught the young prince biology, medicine, philosophy, and literature in a quiet garden sanctuary among the Nymphaeum's limestone colonnades. By early spring of 334 before the Common Era, the army gathers along the Macedonian coast. The fleet rides at anchor. The infantry sharpens sarissa points and checks the bronze fittings of aspis shields. The companion cavalry grooms their Thessalian war horses. Everything Philip designed, everything he built, everything he dreamed stands ready. The young king who silenced Greece in a single season now turns his gaze eastward toward the vast and ancient empire of Persia. The fleet launches from the European shore in the spring of 334 before the Common Era, and the Hellespont narrows to barely a mile of dark water between two continents. 160 warships and countless transport vessels carry 32,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry across the strait that separates Europe from Asia. Alexander himself steers the royal trireme toward the Asian coast, and at the midpoint of the crossing he sacrifices a bull to Poseidon and pours libations from a golden cup into the sea. When the prow touches sand, he hurls a spear into the shore, a gesture claiming Asia as territory won by the spear. Before marching south to meet the Persian forces already gathering against him, Alexander turns north toward the windswept ruins of Troy. The ancient city sits on a low ridge above the Scamander plain, its stones weathered by 8 centuries since the age Homer immortalized. At the Temple of Athena, Alexander dedicates his own armor and takes down from the walls a sacred shield said to date from the Trojan War. He lays a wreath at the burial mound traditionally identified as the tomb of Achilles, his ancestor through his mother Olympias, and his companion Hephaestion honors the tomb of Patroclus beside it. The gesture is deliberate. Alexander frames this invasion not merely as conquest, but as a continuation of the ancient Greek struggle against the East. The Persian satraps of Western Asia Minor do not wait. They assemble a force of perhaps 20,000 cavalry and nearly as many Greek mercenary infantry along the eastern bank of the Granicus River, a shallow waterway that cuts through rolling terrain near the Sea of Marmara. The Persian commanders choose to hold the riverbank itself, their cavalry lining the steep eastern bluff where the muddy bottom gives way to a sharp embankment. It is a strong defensive position, and Parmenion, Alexander's most experienced general, counsels delay until dawn. Alexander refuses. In the late afternoon of a May day, the Macedonian cavalry plunges into the river. The companion cavalry drives across the current in a wedge formation aimed at the Persian center left. Alexander himself at the point, identifiable by his white plumed helmet and polished cuirass. The fighting along the riverbank is savage and close. Persian cavalry commanders target Alexander directly. A sword blow shatters his helmet. The satrap Spithridates raises a scimitar for a killing stroke from behind, and in that instant Clytus the Black, commander of the royal squadron, severs the Persian's arm with a single cut. Alexander survives by the margin of one man's reflexes. The Macedonian cavalry gains the bank. The phalanx crosses behind them, sarissa points leveled, and the Persian line breaks. The Greek mercenaries serving Persia, perhaps 6,000 strong, form a defensive square on a hillside and request terms. Alexander refuses and orders the phalanx to assault them directly. The slaughter is methodical. Only 2,000 survive as prisoners. Alexander sends 300 captured Persian panoplies to Athens as an offering to Athena, inscribed with a message declaring the victory won by Alexander and the Greeks, except the Spartans, who refused to join. The road south opens. Sardis, the ancient Lydian capital and seat of Persian administration in western Anatolia, surrenders without resistance. Its garrison commander hands over the citadel and its treasury. Alexander restores local laws and grants tax relief. At Ephesus, the population overthrows its Persian-backed oligarchy before the Macedonians arrive, and Alexander installs a democratic government, redirecting the taxes once paid to Persia toward the rebuilding of the great temple of Artemis. City after city along the Ionian coast welcomes the Macedonian army as liberators from decades of Persian control. At Miletus, the pattern shifts. The city's garrison refuses to surrender, trusting in the Persian fleet anchored nearby. Alexander's forces storm the walls while his own fleet blocks the harbor entrance, denying the Persian navy access to fresh water along the coast. After Miletus falls, Alexander makes a decision of extraordinary boldness. He disbands most of his own fleet, keeping only a few transport vessels. The expense is unsustainable, and he cannot match Persian naval strength at sea. Instead, he will defeat the Persian navy by land, capturing every port, every harbor, every coastal city along the Mediterranean rim until the enemy fleet has nowhere to anchor, nowhere to resupply, nowhere to exist. It is a strategy that will take 2 years to complete, and it will work. The road inland from the Aegean coast climbs through the sun-bleached hills of Phrygia, winding past villages where farmers still speak languages older than any Greek dialect. By the early spring of 333 before the Common Era, Alexander's army reaches Gordium, the ancient Phrygian capital perched above the Sangarius River. The city is modest now, a shadow of its former prominence, but it holds something that draws the young king's attention with magnetic force. Inside the Acropolis, near the temple precinct sacred to Zeus, an ancient ox cart stands lashed to a post by a knot of cornel bark so intricately tangled that no visible ends present themselves. Legend holds that whoever loosens this binding will rule all of Asia. The knot has resisted every attempt for generations. What Alexander does next varies across ancient accounts. Some say he slices it with his sword, others that he pulls the pin from the yoke pole, collapsing the entire assembly. What matters is the result. The knot is undone. The prophecy, whether believed or manufactured, now belongs to him. Alexander rests his army at Gordium through the spring, gathering reinforcements from Macedonia. 3,000 fresh infantry and 300 cavalry cross the Hellespont to join him. Then the march resumes southeastward through the Cilician Gates, the narrow mountain pass cutting through the Taurus range. The army threads single file through this defile, and a handful of defenders could have held it indefinitely, but the Persian garrison flees at the Macedonian approach. Alexander descends into the humid coastal plain of Cilicia and falls dangerously ill at Tarsus after plunging into the frigid Cydnus River. For days, fever grips him while his physicians hesitate. He recovers, but precious weeks are lost. those weeks prove consequential. Darius III has assembled the full imperial levy. Ancient sources claim 600,000 men, though modern estimates suggest perhaps 100,000, and marches this enormous force not to block Alexander's advance, but to swing behind him, cutting his supply lines. Darius crosses the Amanus Mountains through the northern passes and descends to the coastal town of Issus, where he discovers and massacres the Macedonian sick and wounded left behind. Alexander, already moving south toward Syria, suddenly learns that the great king stands between him and his own line of retreat. He turns his army around and marches north through the night. The battlefield reveals itself at dawn on a November morning. The Pinarus River cuts across a narrow coastal strip, barely 2.5 kilometers wide, hemmed between the Amanus Mountains to the east and the Mediterranean Sea to the west. This constriction nullifies the Persian numerical advantage entirely. Darius cannot deploy his vast army in depth. He stations his best Greek mercenary infantry at the river's center, cavalry on the coastal flank, and positions himself in his royal chariot behind the center, surrounded by his personal guard. Alexander reads the terrain instantly. He anchors his left flank under Parmenion against the sea, deploys the phalanx battalions across the center, and takes personal command of the companion cavalry on the right, nearest the mountains. The Macedonians advance at a measured pace, maintaining their line across the uneven ground. Then Alexander accelerates. The companions surge across the Pinarus in a wedge formation aimed directly at the Persian left, shattering the lighter troops stationed there. The charge wheels inward, rolling up the Persian line from its flank. In the center, the phalanx struggles. The riverbanks are steep. The Greek mercenaries fighting for Darius are disciplined and fierce, and gaps open in the Macedonian formation. Casualties mount. But the companion cavalry's devastating flank attack decides the battle before the center can collapse. The Persian left disintegrates. The pressure cascades toward Darius himself. The great king, seeing Macedonian cavalry driving toward his position, turns his chariot and flees eastward through the Amanus passes. The rout becomes total. Persian dead choke the riverbed and the narrow plain. Ancient sources record over 100,000 casualties, though the true figure is unknowable. What is certain is what Darius leaves behind: his royal tent with its golden vessels and perfumed baths, his war chest, and his family. His mother Sysigambis, his wife Statera, and his daughters fall into Macedonian hands. Alexander treats them with conspicuous respect, maintaining their royal status and comfort. The gesture is political as much as personal. He is not merely defeating the Persian king, he is replacing him. The Phoenician coast stretches southward from the battlefield at Issus, a ribbon of ancient trading cities pressed between the Lebanon mountains and the Mediterranean. Most surrender without resistance. Byblos opens its gates. Sidon, long resentful of Tyrian dominance, welcomes the Macedonians. But Tyre refuses. The city sits half a mile offshore on an island fortress ringed by walls rising 150 feet from the waterline. Its harbors face north and south, sheltering a formidable fleet. The Tyrians believe their position is impregnable. No army has ever taken the island by assault. Alexander arrives in January of 332 before the Common Era, and recognizes immediately that naval power alone will not suffice. He orders the construction of a mole, a massive stone causeway stretching from the mainland across the channel to the island itself. The engineering is staggering. Workers dump rubble, timber, and stone into water that reaches 18 feet deep near the island's edge. Tyrian warships harass the builders with arrows and fire ships. The defenders launch a devastating attack with a converted horse transport packed with combustible materials, destroying 2 siege towers at the mole's tip. Alexander adapts. He widens the causeway, constructs protective screens, and assembles a coalition fleet from Sidon, Byblos, Cyprus, and Rhodes, nearly 200 warships that seal both Tyrian harbors. Siege engines mounted on barges pound the walls from the sea while the mole inches forward. For 7 months the assault continues, a grinding testament to Macedonian obstinacy. In August, simultaneous attacks from the causeway and from ship-borne assault bridges finally breach the southern wall. The slaughter that follows is merciless. 8,000 Tyrians perish in the fighting. 30,000 survivors are sold into slavery. Alexander crucifies 2,000 military-age men along the beach as a warning to other cities contemplating resistance. The army turns south. Gaza, perched on a high tell overlooking the desert approaches to Egypt, holds out under its garrison commander for 2 months before falling to siege mines that collapse its fortifications. The road to Egypt lies open. The Macedonian army crosses the Sinai in late 332 and enters the Nile Delta to a reception that astonishes even Alexander's veterans. Egypt has chafed under Persian rule for nearly 2 centuries. The satrap Mazaces, commanding no significant garrison, surrenders without a fight. Egyptian priests welcome Alexander as a liberator, and at Memphis he sacrifices to the Apis bull, honoring local religious tradition in deliberate contrast to Persian contempt for Egyptian sacred customs. In January of 331 before the Common Era, Alexander rides west along the Mediterranean coast to a narrow strip of land between Lake Mareotis and the sea. Here, where a limestone ridge meets a natural double harbour sheltered by the island of Pharos, he marks out the boundaries of a new city. Alexandria is planned on a Hippodamian grid, broad intersecting avenues, designated quarters for Greek settlers and Egyptian residents, sites reserved for temples, agoras, and harbours. The architect Dinocrates oversees the layout. The city will become the greatest metropolis of the ancient Mediterranean, but in this moment it is only lines traced in barley flour across sandy ground, the grains carried away by flocking birds. From Alexandria, Alexander undertakes the most mysterious journey of his life. He marches west along the coast to Paratonium, then turns south into the Libyan desert toward the oasis of Siwa, home to the ancient oracle of Ammon, whom the Greeks identify with Zeus. The column travels 8 days across featureless sand and gravel plains. Ancient accounts describe the army nearly perishing from thirst before unexpected rains save them. At Siwa, the oasis appears suddenly. Date palms, freshwater springs, a mud-brick temple nestled among sandstone cliffs. Alexander enters the inner sanctum alone to consult the oracle. What the priests tell him remains his secret. He later confides only that he received the answer his heart desired. Ancient sources report that the priest addresses him as son of Ammon. Whether this reflects genuine Egyptian protocol for a pharaoh or something more personal, the visit transforms Alexander's self-conception. He departs Siwa carrying a new dimension of authority, no longer merely a Macedonian king or a Greek hegemon, but something approaching the divine, a mortal reaching toward the gods whose favor seems to confirm his extraordinary destiny. The army marches east from Egypt through the furnace of the Syrian desert, crossing the Euphrates at Thapsacus in late summer of 331 before the Common Era. Alexander chooses a northern route, following the Tigris upstream rather than driving directly toward Babylon, keeping the river on his right flank and the cooler highland air at his back. Scouts report that Darius has chosen his ground, a broad plain near the village of Gaugamela, east of the Tigris, not far from the ruins of ancient Nineveh. The great king has spent months preparing this field, ordering the earth leveled and smoothed to give his scythed chariots and cavalry an unobstructed killing ground. This time, there will be no narrow coastal pass to neutralize Persian numbers. Darius intends to use every advantage of space. The Persian army assembles from every corner of the empire. Bactrian cavalry, Indian war elephants, Scythian horse archers, Babylonian infantry, the elite cavalry from Media and Persia itself. Ancient sources estimate the force at somewhere between 100,000 and 250,000, though modern scholarship tends toward the lower figure. 200 scythed chariots stand ready, their axle blades designed to shred infantry formations. Darius positions himself at the center, surrounded by his royal guard, the Immortals, and Greek mercenary hoplites. Against this host, Alexander fields roughly 47,000 men. On the night of September 30th, the Macedonian camp stirs with quiet preparation. Alexander's generals urge a night attack to exploit the darkness against superior numbers. Alexander refuses. He will defeat Darius in daylight, in full view of both armies, so that no excuse of surprise diminishes the victory. He sleeps so soundly that Parmenion must wake him at dawn. The morning of October 1st reveals the battlefield in its enormity. Dust hangs in the still air above the Persian lines, which stretch so far beyond the Macedonian flanks that encirclement seems inevitable. Alexander arranges his forces with characteristic precision. The phalanx holds the center, 6 battalions deep, their sarissa pikes angled forward in a bristling wall. Parmenion commands the left wing with the Thessalian cavalry. Alexander takes the right with the companion cavalry, positioning himself at the tip of the decisive wedge. The advance begins obliquely, drifting rightward, pulling the Persian line off its leveled ground. Darius launches his scythed chariots, but Macedonian light troops, javelin throwers and archers, cut down the chariot horses or simply open lanes, letting the vehicles thunder harmlessly through gaps in the formation. The chariots achieve almost nothing. As Alexander continues his rightward drift, Bessus on the Persian left extends to match him, opening a gap near the center of the Persian line. Alexander sees it. He wheels the companion cavalry inward and charges directly at Darius through the breach, the wedge formation cutting like an iron point through linen. The impact is devastating. Persian infantry crumbles before the momentum of the charge. Alexander drives toward the great king's chariot with terrifying speed. Darius breaks. For the second time, the King of Kings turns his chariot and flees the field while his army still fights. The Persian center collapses. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion faces desperate pressure from Persian and Indian cavalry that has punched through gaps in the phalanx, but Alexander's victorious right wing wheels to relieve him, and the Persian assault disintegrates. The pursuit continues for miles across the darkening plain. Thousands of Persian soldiers die in the rout. Darius escapes eastward into the mountains of Media, but his empire is finished. The treasury at Arbela falls intact. Alexander turned south toward Babylon. The greatest city in Mesopotamia opens its gates without resistance. The Macedonian army marches through the Ishtar Gate, glazed blue bricks depicting bulls and dragons gleaming in the autumn light, while Babylonian priests scatter flowers and burn incense along the processional way. Alexander sacrifices to Marduk, the city's patron god, and orders the restoration of temples Xerxes had damaged. Babylon embraces its new master. From Babylon, the army advances to Susa, the administrative heart of the Achaemenid Empire. The treasury vaults yield 50,000 talents of gold and silver bullion, wealth accumulated over 2 centuries of imperial taxation. The sheer volume requires thousands of pack animals to transport. Alexander sits upon the throne of the great king in the audience hall, where Persian monarchs once received tribute from 23 subject nations. The Achaemenid Empire, which has governed the ancient Near East for more than 200 years, has effectively ceased to exist. Its conqueror is 25 years old. The road south from Susa climbs through the Zagros Mountains in the dead of winter, winding along narrow passes where snow clings to limestone ridges and the wind cuts through woolen cloaks. The army advances toward Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid dynasty, a city most Greeks have only heard described in awed whispers. At the Persian gates, a narrow mountain defile, the satrap Ariobarzanes blocks the route with a force of perhaps 40,000 defenders. The pass is nearly impassable, but local shepherds reveal a mountain trail that loops behind the Persian position. Alexander divides his forces, leads a flanking column through freezing darkness over goat tracks, and strikes the defenders from the rear. The resistance collapses. The road to Persepolis lies open. In January of 330 before the Common Era, Macedonian soldiers descend from the highlands onto the Marv-dashed plain and behold the greatest architectural complex in the ancient world. The terrace of Persepolis rises from the plain on a massive stone platform, its double staircase carved with processions of tribute-bearing nations, Medes in rounded caps, Babylonians carrying textiles, Indians leading a donkey, Ethiopians with ivory tusks. 23 peoples of the empire march in eternal stone toward the Apadana, the great audience hall where 72 columns once supported a cedar-beamed roof soaring 20 meters above a polished floor. The throne hall of Xerxes, the treasury, the harem, the council hall, each structure represents generations of craftsmanship in polished limestone, glazed brick, and carved wooden beams inlaid with gold leaf. The treasury alone yields 120,000 talents of bullion, a sum so vast it staggers comprehension. Combined with the wealth seized at Susa and Babylon, Alexander now commands more precious metal than any ruler in recorded history. 10,000 mule pairs and 5,000 camels are required to transport it. For 4 months the army occupies Persepolis. Then, in May of 330 before the Common Era, fire engulfs the palaces. Whether the burning is a calculated act of retribution for Xerxes' destruction of the Athenian Acropolis 150 years earlier, or a spontaneous act during a banquet, ancient sources disagree. Diodorus attributes the instigation to the Athenian courtesan Thais. Arrian presents it as a deliberate policy decision. What remains beyond dispute is the result. Flames consume the cedar roofing, crack the stone columns, and melt the gold fittings. The charred column bases still stand today on the Marv-dashed plain, blackened witnesses to that night. Alexander marches northeast in pursuit of Darius III, who flees with a dwindling retinue through Media and into the eastern provinces. The great king who once commanded millions now depends on the loyalty of a handful of satraps. That loyalty fractures. Bessus, satrap of Bactria, and Barcentes, satrap of Arachosia, seize Darius and hold him prisoner, hoping to use him as a bargaining instrument or replace him entirely. The pursuit covers hundreds of miles through the arid Iranian plateau. Alexander drives his cavalry forward at punishing speed, abandoning slower infantry units, racing through landscapes of dust and scrub, where water sources are scarce and settlements sparse. Near the town of Hekatompilos, intelligence arrives that Bessus has stabbed Darius and left him dying in a wagon by the roadside. A Macedonian advance party finds the body in July of 330 before the Common Era. The last Achaemenid king lies in a covered cart, pierced by javelins, already dead. Alexander reportedly drapes his own cloak over the corpse. He orders the body sent to Persepolis for royal burial in the tombs of the Achaemenid kings at nearby Naksh-i-Rostam, where Darius joins his ancestors in rock-cut chambers carved into the cliff face. Alexander now assumes the titles and ceremonial dress of the Persian monarchy. He is no longer merely a Macedonian king leading a Greek crusade. He is the legitimate successor to Cyrus and Darius, ruler of an empire stretching from the Adriatic to the Hindu Kush. Bessus, who has declared himself great king under the name Artaxerxes V, becomes not merely a fugitive, but a regicide and usurper whom Alexander is honor-bound to hunt down. The campaign that began as a war of conquest transforms into something far more complex, the governance of a vast, multicultural empire whose new master intends not to dismantle it, but to inhabit its throne. The pursuit of Bessus leads the army into a landscape unlike anything the Macedonians have ever known. In the spring of 330 before the Common Era, the columns march south from the ruins of Darius's kingdom toward the Hindu Kush, that colossal wall of rock and ice that separates the Iranian plateau from the valleys of Bactria. The passes rise to nearly 12,000 feet. Snow blankets the trails even in late spring, and the air thins until men gasp with every step. Pack animals collapse under their loads. Frostbite blackens fingers and toes. The army crosses in approximately 17 days, descending into the broad plains around Drapsaka, where the land opens into the arid vastness of what is now northern Afghanistan. Bessus retreats beyond the Oxus River, scorching the earth behind him. But his support crumbles. His own officers seize him and deliver him to Alexander's advance guard under Ptolemy. The usurper is mutilated in Persian fashion, his nose and ears cut off, and later executed at Ecbatana. The pretender is gone, but the war is far from over. The eastern satrapies refuse to submit quietly. A Sogdian nobleman named Spitamenes emerges as the architect of a resistance that will consume Alexander's forces for nearly 2 years. The warfare transforms completely. There are no massed armies to shatter with a cavalry charge, no great kings to chase from the field. Instead, mounted raiders strike supply lines, ambush garrisons, and vanish into the steppe grasslands that stretch endlessly north of the Oxus. Spitamenes allies with Scythian nomads from beyond the Jaxartes River, and together they annihilate an entire Macedonian detachment near Maracanda, modern Samarkand, killing over 2,000 soldiers in a running battle along a riverbank. It is one of the worst defeats of Alexander's career. Alexander responds with relentless force and strategic city founding. On the banks of the Haxartes, At the very edge of the known world, he establishes Alexandria Eschate, Alexandria the furthest, in the summer of 329 before the Common Era. The city rises in just 20 days, a fortified garrison settlement meant to anchor Macedonian control against the nomadic peoples beyond. He crosses the Jaxartes itself, defeats a Scythian force on the far bank with a coordinated assault of archers, slingers, and cavalry, then withdraws to consolidate. The counterinsurgency grinds on through 328 before the Common Era. Alexander divides his forces into mobile columns that sweep through Sogdian valleys, burning strongholds and resettling populations. Spitamenes continues to strike and fade until his own Scythian allies, weary of Macedonian retaliation, murder him and send his head to Alexander. Yet the cost of this campaign extends beyond casualties. At Maracanda, during a banquet heavy with unmixed wine, a quarrel erupts between Alexander and Clytus the Black, the veteran commander who saved his life at the Granicus 4 years earlier. The argument escalates over Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and his perceived abandonment of Macedonian traditions. In a moment of drunken fury, Alexander seizes a javelin and kills Clytus. The aftermath is devastating. Alexander collapses in grief for 3 days, refusing food and drink. The army is shaken. The man who commands the largest empire in the Western world has murdered one of his oldest companions with his own hand. The fortress of the Sogdian Rock falls in the winter of 327 before the Common Era, its defenders confident that only winged soldiers could scale its ice-covered cliffs. Alexander calls for volunteers. 300 men climb through the night using tent pegs and flax ropes. 30 fall to their deaths in the darkness. But at dawn, the garrison looks up to find Macedonian soldiers above them and surrenders. Among the captives is Roxane, daughter of the Bactrian nobleman Oxyates. Alexander marries her in a ceremony that blends Macedonian and local traditions, a union both political and, by all ancient accounts, genuinely desired. The mountains of Central Asia have changed the nature of Alexander's war, and the character of Alexander himself. The young king who crossed the Hellespont with the clarity of a Homeric hero now governs through a volatile mixture of brilliance, brutality, and cultural ambition that unsettles the very men who made his conquests possible. In the spring of 327 before the Common Era, the army descends from the highlands of Bactria through the passes of the Hindu Kush for a second time, moving south and east into the lands the Greeks call India. The landscape transforms with each day's march. Alpine snow gives way to subtropical forest, and the air thickens with humidity as the columns enter the valleys of Gandhara, where the Kabul River carves its path toward the Indus. Local rulers submit or resist in turn. The fortress of Ionos, perched on a massive rock above the Indus, falls after a siege that requires the construction of an earthen ramp across a deep ravine. Greek tradition holds that Heracles himself failed to take this place. Alexander succeeds. The army crosses the Indus in the early months of 326 before the Common Era on a bridge of boats and enters the kingdom of Taxiles, whose ruler welcomes the Macedonians as allies against his rival to the east. That rival is Porus, a king of formidable stature who commands the lands beyond the Hydaspes River, with an army that includes perhaps 200 war elephants. The monsoon has begun. Rain falls in sheets that turn the riverbanks to mud and swell the Hydaspes into a roaring torrent. Porus stations his forces along the far bank, his elephants arrayed in a line that no cavalry horse will willingly approach. Alexander devises one of his most audacious plans. He leaves a detachment under Craterus at the main crossing to hold Porus in place, then marches 17 miles upstream through a night of torrential rain with 11,000 men. They cross at dawn on a wooded island, the horses swimming through swollen currents. Porus sends his son with cavalry and chariots to intercept, but the force is overwhelmed. The young prince dies in the fighting. Porus turns his full army to face Alexander, anchoring his line on the elephants. The beasts are terrifying, trampling infantry and seizing men with their trunks. But the Macedonian phalanx learns to target the animals' legs and mayhouts with sarissa thrusts, while mounted archers harass them from the flanks. The elephants, wounded and maddened, begin to stampede backward through their own ranks. Craterus crosses the river and strikes the disintegrating Persian-Indian line from behind. The battle becomes a rout. Porus, wounded in the shoulder, is brought before Alexander on his war elephant. Asked how he wishes to be treated, the Indian king requests treatment befitting a king. Alexander restores his kingdom and adds territory to it, recognizing a worthy adversary. But victory carries its own grief. Bucephalus, Alexander's legendary war horse, companion since boyhood, dies shortly after the battle, likely from wounds and age. Alexander founds 2 cities at the battlefield, Nicaea for victory, and Bucephala in honor of the horse. The army presses eastward through weeks of unrelenting monsoon rain. Armor rusts, leather rots, snakes infest the sodden camps. At the Hyphasis River, the soldiers reach their limit. Beyond lies the vast Gangetic plain, rumored to be defended by armies far larger than anything yet encountered. The men refuse to march further. Coenus, one of Alexander's most trusted commanders, speaks for the army's exhaustion. Alexander retreats to his tent for 3 days, waiting for the troops to relent. They do not. For the first and only time, Alexander yields. He erects 12 massive altars to the Olympian gods to mark the eastern boundary of his march, then turns the army south. The return follows the Indus downstream. A fleet of nearly 800 vessels carries troops and supplies while columns march along both banks, fighting fierce resistance from the Mali and other peoples. During the siege of a Malian citadel, Alexander leaps from the wall into the city with only 3 companions and takes an arrow through his lung. He nearly dies. The army, believing him dead, massacres the inhabitants. The fleet reaches the Indian Ocean in the summer of 325, before the Common Era. Nearchus takes the navy westward along the coast, while Alexander leads the main column through the Gedrosian desert, a wasteland of sand and scorching heat across modern Balochistan. The march becomes a catastrophe. Water sources fail. Pack animals collapse. Soldiers die of thirst, heat stroke, and flash floods that sweep through dry riverbeds at night. Ancient sources suggest between 1/4 and nearly half of those who enter the desert perish. After 60 days, the survivors stagger into the satrapy of Carmania, gaunt and broken. The empire Alexander has built now stretches from the Adriatic to the Indus, but the cost of reaching its edge is measured in the bones bleaching beneath Gedrosian sands. The survivors who emerge from Carmania's valleys in the autumn of 325 before the Common Era find an empire in disorder. Satraps and governors, believing Alexander dead in India, have embezzled treasuries, raised private armies, and abused their subjects. The reckoning is swift and merciless. Alexander executes or replaces at least 6 satraps within months, including men who have governed since the earliest days of the conquest. The message reverberates across 3 continents. The king has returned, and no distance grants immunity from his judgment. At Susa in the spring of 324 before the Common Era, Alexander stages the most extraordinary wedding ceremony the ancient world has ever witnessed. A vast pavilion rises in the palace grounds, its interior draped with embroidered curtains and furnished with silver-footed couches. Alexander himself marries Statera, eldest daughter of the dead Darius III, and simultaneously weds Parysatis, daughter of the previous Persian king Artaxerxes III. 80 of his senior officers take Persian and Median brides in the same ceremony, conducted according to Persian custom. Each groom receives a golden cup, and 5 days of feasting follow. 10,000 Macedonian soldiers who have taken Asian wives receive wedding gifts and have their debts paid from the royal treasury. The cost is staggering. The intent is unmistakable. Alexander envisions not conquest alone, but fusion, a ruling class born of both civilizations. The army does not share this vision. At Opis on the Tigris in the summer of 324 before the Common Era, Alexander announces the discharge of veteran Macedonians, too old or wounded for further service. The troops erupt. They see not generosity, but replacement. 30,000 Persian youths, the epigonoi, trained in Macedonian tactics and armed with sarissas, stand ready to fill their ranks. Soldiers shout that Alexander should campaign with his father, Ammon, mocking his divine pretensions. Alexander leaps from the platform, personally seizes 13 ringleaders, and orders their execution. He then retreats into the palace and refuses all contact for 2 days, appointing Persians to command positions traditionally held by Macedonians. The army breaks. Veterans weep at the gates, begging reconciliation. Alexander emerges, and a great banquet of 9,000 follows, where Macedonians and Persians pour libations together from the same mixing bowls. In the autumn, at Ecbatana, catastrophe strikes not on a battlefield, but in a sick room. Hephaestion, Alexander's most intimate companion since boyhood, his second in command and chiliarch of the empire, falls ill with fever. After 7 days, he dies. Alexander's grief surpasses all restraint. He orders the physician crucified. He shears the manes of all horses and mules in the army. He sends to the oracle of Ammon at Siwa, requesting that Hephaestion receive divine honors. A funeral pyre of extraordinary scale rises in Babylon. Ancient sources describe it as 200 feet tall, adorned with gilded eagles, ships' prows, and sculptured lions, costing 10,000 talents. Alexander throws himself into planning new campaigns. Fleets are constructed on the Euphrates for the exploration and conquest of Arabia. Embassies arrive from across the Mediterranean, from Carthage, from Italian peoples, perhaps from Iberia. The scope of his ambition now encompasses the entire known world. In late May of 323 before the Common Era, after a prolonged banquet at the house of his companion Medius, Alexander develops a fever. Day by day, the illness worsens. He continues issuing orders, planning the Arabian expedition, offering sacrifices. By the end of the first week of June, he can no longer speak. His soldiers, hearing rumors of his death, demand to see him. They file past his bed one by one, and Alexander raises his head or moves his eyes to acknowledge each man. Asked to whom he leaves his empire, the dying king whispers a single phrase, "To the strongest." On the 10th or 11th of June, 323 before the Common Era, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, Alexander III of Macedon dies. He is 32 years old. His empire, the largest the Western world has known, stretches from the shores of the Adriatic to the banks of the Indus, encompassing perhaps 50 million souls. It has no heir capable of holding it. The age of the conqueror ends in a lamplit room beside the Euphrates, and the age of the successors begins. Within hours of the last breath leaving Alexander's body, the palace of Nebuchadnezzar becomes a theatre of ambition. The infantry and cavalry nearly come to blows over succession. Perdiccas, holding Alexander's signet ring, brokers a fragile compromise known as the Partition of Babylon in the summer of 323 before the Common Era. Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother, a man of limited mental capacity, is declared king alongside the unborn child Roxane carries. Perdiccas assumes the regency. The satrapies are distributed among the generals like parcels of land at auction. Ptolemy receives Egypt. Antigonus Monophthalmus, the one-eyed veteran, retains Phrygia and much of Anatolia. Lysimachus takes Thrace. Antipater and his son Cassander hold Macedonia and Greece. Seleucus for now commands the elite companion cavalry under Perdiccas. The arrangement is a fiction of unity draped over irreconcilable rivalries. Ptolemy strikes first, not with a sword, but with a corpse. Alexander's funeral cortege, an enormous gold-panelled hearse drawn by 64 mules, departs Babylon for Macedonia. Ptolemy intercepts it in Syria and diverts the body to Egypt, eventually installing it in a magnificent tomb in Alexandria. Possession of Alexander's remains confers a legitimacy no treaty can match. Perdiccas invades Egypt in 321 before the Common Era to reclaim the body and punish Ptolemy's defiance. The campaign ends in catastrophe at the Nile, where crocodiles devour soldiers attempting a river crossing, and Perdiccas's own officers murder him in his tent. The first regent is dead within 2 years. A new partition at Triparadisus in 320 before the Common Era redistributes power. Antipater becomes regent. Seleucus receives Babylonia. But Antipater dies of old age in 319, and his son Cassander seizes Macedonia by force. Olympias, Alexander's ferocious mother, has Philip III Aridaeus and his wife Eurydice executed in 317. Cassander retaliates by besieging Olympias at Pydna and executing her in 316. He then holds Roxane and the young Alexander IV as prisoners. The wars intensify. Antigonus, controlling the largest territory from Anatolia to Mesopotamia, declares himself master of the empire. He drives Seleucus from Babylon in 316, but Seleucus flees to Ptolemy's Egypt and rebuilds his strength. In 312 before the Common Era, Ptolemy defeats Antigonus's son Demetrius at the Battle of Gaza, and Seleucus rides east with a small cavalry force to reclaim Babylon. This date, 312 later becomes year 1 of the Seleucid calendar, marking the foundation of a dynasty that will endure for centuries. Cassander orders the murder of Roxane and the 13-year-old Alexander IV around 310 before the Common Era. The Argead bloodline, stretching back through centuries of mountain kings to the mythic sons of Heracles, is extinguished entirely. No legitimate heir remains. The generals now fight openly for personal kingdoms. The climax arrives on the plains of Ipsus in central Phrygia in 301 before the Common Era. Antigonus, now 81 years old, and his son Demetrius Poliorcetes face the combined forces of Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander. Seleucus brings 400 war elephants acquired from the Mauryan king Chandragupta in exchange for the eastern satrapies. Demetrius's cavalry charges brilliantly, but pursues too far. Seleucus wheels his elephants into the gap, cutting Demetrius off from his father's infantry. Antigonus stands his ground, waiting for his son to return. A javelin strikes him down. The old general dies on the field, and with him dies the last serious attempt to reunify Alexander's empire under a single ruler. After Ipsus, the map crystallizes. Seleucus controls the vast eastern territories from Syria to the borders of India. Ptolemy holds Egypt, Cyprus, and coastal enclaves. Lysimachus governs Thrace and western Anatolia. Cassander rules Macedonia until his death. The empire that one man built in 11 years of conquest has taken his successors 22 years of war to divide. The world Alexander made is now permanently fractured, and from its shards, new kingdoms rise. The shards settle into shapes that will endure for generations. In the decades following Ipsus, 3 great dynasties consolidate their grip on the fractured world Alexander left behind, each forging a kingdom distinct in character, yet bound by the common thread of Greek language, Greek gods, and Greek ambition. In Egypt, Ptolemy, son of Lagus, rules from Alexandria, the city Alexander himself traced into the limestone dust of the Nile Delta. By the turn of the 3rd century before the Common Era, Alexandria has grown into the most extraordinary urban creation of the ancient world. Its streets follow a precise grid aligned with the prevailing Mediterranean winds, broad avenues intersecting at right angles, lined with colonnaded stowers of white limestone. The royal quarter occupies the northeastern promontory, a complex of palaces, gardens, and harbours where Ptolemy governs with the careful pragmatism of a man who survived 40 years of war. He establishes the Musion, a temple to the Muses that functions as the ancient world's first state-funded research institution. Scholars receive stipends, lodging, and access to the great library, where hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls accumulate. Every text that arrives in Alexandria's harbour is copied, the original kept, the copy returned. Ptolemy II, who succeeds his father around 283 before the Common Era, commissions the Pharos lighthouse on the island guarding the harbour entrance. Rising over 100 metres, its beacon fire reflected by polished bronze mirrors, it becomes one of the wonders of the ancient world. Eastward, Seleucus commands territories of staggering scale. His empire stretches from the Aegean coast of Anatolia to the frontiers of India, encompassing Mesopotamia, Persia, Media, and the highlands of Central Asia. Governing this vastness requires an unprecedented program of urbanization. Seleucus and his son Antiochus found over 60 new cities, seeding Greek-speaking communities across the ancient Near East. Antioch on the Orontes River, established around 300 before the Common Era, becomes the western capital, a planned city of 4 quarters with an agora, theatre, gymnasium, and royal palace nestled between Mount Silpius and the river. Seleucia on the Tigris serves as the eastern capital, replacing Babylon as the administrative heart of Mesopotamia. Each new foundation carries a gymnasium where young men train in athletics and study Homer, transplanting Hellenic civic culture into landscapes where cuneiform tablets had recorded royal decrees for millennia. Macedonia itself, the homeland that started everything, suffers most. Cassander dies around 297 before the Common Era, and his sons destroy each other in fratricidal war. The throne passes through a succession of claimants. Demetrius Poliorcetes seizes it briefly, then Pyrrhus of Epirus, then Lysimachus. In 281, Seleucus defeats and kills Lysimachus at the Battle of Corupedium, only to be assassinated himself months later. Macedonia descends into chaos. Then, in 279, catastrophe arrives from the north. Massive Celtic war bands, the Galatians, pour through the Balkans, sacking Thrace and driving deep into Greece. They reach Delphi itself before being repulsed. It falls to Antigonus II, called Gonatas, grandson of the one-eyed general who died at Ipsus, to restore order. His decisive defeat of the Galatians near Lysimachia around 277 establishes Antigonid legitimacy. He rules Macedonia with austere Stoic discipline from Pella, rebuilding the army and stabilizing the kingdom's battered frontiers. 3 kingdoms now govern the world Alexander conquered. They war with each other at the margins, compete for allies and trade routes, and jealously guard their dynasties. Yet Greek remains the language of administration from the Nile to the Oxus. Gymnasia rise in Egyptian villages and Mesopotamian towns alike. The same architectural vocabulary of column, entablature, and pediment adorns temples in Alexandria, Antioch, and Pella. A scholar from Syracuse can study in Alexandria, correspond with colleagues in Pergamon, and read texts preserved from Aristotle's own library. The political unity Alexander imposed by force has shattered, but the cultural unity persists, deepens, and spreads, a Hellenistic civilization that transcends any single throne. The cultural unity that persists across 3 continents now produces something unprecedented in human history, a civilization where knowledge itself becomes an institution. In Alexandria, on the grounds of the royal quarter near the harbor, the Mouseion stands as a temple not to a single god, but to the Muses themselves. Ptolemy II Philadelphus expands what his father began, funding a community of scholars who receive stipends, free meals, and lodging in exchange for one obligation, the pursuit of understanding. The library attached to this complex grows toward hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls. Every arriving ship in the harbor searched for texts that scribes copy before returning the originals, or sometimes keeping them. Within these colonnaded halls around 270 before the Common Era, Euclid composes the Elements, 13 books that organize the whole of known geometry into a system of definitions, postulates, and proofs so rigorous that it will remain the standard mathematical text for over 2,000 years. His method, beginning from self-evident axioms and building toward complex theorems through pure logical deduction, becomes the very model of rational inquiry. A generation later, Eratosthenes of Cyrene serves as the library's chief librarian. Hearing that at noon on the summer solstice, a vertical stick in Siena casts no shadow, while one in Alexandria casts a shadow of roughly 7 degrees, he measures the distance between the 2 cities and calculates the Earth's circumference at approximately 250,000 stadia, a figure remarkably close to the true value. The world, measured by a single mind with a stick and a shadow, reveals its scale. In Syracuse, Archimedes works in productive isolation, corresponding with Alexandrian colleagues. His treatises on the lever, on floating bodies, on the measurement of the circle and the sphere push mathematics into realms of practical and theoretical power that antiquity will not surpass. The principle of buoyancy, the calculation of pi to extraordinary precision, the conceptual anticipation of integral calculus, all emerge from this one life. The intellectual energy radiates outward through commerce. Trade routes now link the Mediterranean to India and beyond. Seleucid ambassadors exchange gifts and philosophical envoys with the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka, whose rock edicts mention Greek kings by name. Pepper, cinnamon, and silk move westward. Greek silver coins appear in markets from Bactria to the Ganges Valley. In Gandhara, sculptors begin rendering the Buddha in human form for the first time, borrowing the drapery, contrapposto stance, and naturalistic features of Hellenistic statuary. The arts themselves undergo transformation. Sculptors abandon the serene idealism of the classical period for raw emotional intensity. The Dying Gaul, commissioned by the Attalid kings of Pergamon to commemorate their victory over Gallic invaders, depicts a wounded warrior in his final moments, his mustache, his talk, his slumping posture rendered with empathy for a defeated enemy that is entirely new. The Nike of Samothrace, alighting on a ship's prow with wings spread and wet drapery pressed against her body by the sea wind, captures motion itself in marble. On Rhodes, the Colossus, a bronze statue of Helios standing over 30 meters tall, dominates the harbor entrance until an earthquake topples it around 226 before the Common Era. Even fallen, its massive fragments draw visitors for centuries. Meanwhile, in Ptolemaic Alexandria, 72 Jewish scholars reportedly begin translating the Hebrew Torah into Greek, producing the Septuagint. This act of translation carries consequences no one can foresee. It will make Jewish scripture accessible to the entire Greek-speaking world and eventually provide the textual foundation for early Christianity. The Hellenistic agora hums with this convergence. A merchant from Massalia haggles beside a Nabatean spice trader. An Egyptian priest debates cosmology with a Stoic philosopher from Tarsus. Astronomers in Alexandria chart the heavens with instruments of increasing precision, while physicians at the Mausion, permitted for the first time to dissect human cadavers, map the nervous system, and distinguish arteries from veins. Herophilus identifies the brain as the seat of intelligence. Erasistratus traces the vascular system with astonishing accuracy. This is the Hellenistic world at its zenith, not a single empire, but a shared intellectual atmosphere stretching from Sicily to the Hindu Kush, where the Greek language serves as the universal medium of thought, and where the boundaries between cultures grow permeable enough for genuine synthesis. The knowledge accumulating in Alexandria's scrolls, in Pergamon's rival library, in the workshops and observatories scattered across 3 continents, represents a concentration of human understanding that will not be equaled for more than a millennium. Yet beneath this canopy of intellectual achievement, millions of ordinary lives unfold in patterns shaped by the new Hellenistic order. In the villages and towns scattered across 3 continents, soldiers become farmers, farmers become merchants, and philosophers attempt to explain what it all means. In the Fayum Depression southwest of Memphis, a reclamation project transforms marshland into productive farmland. Greek and Macedonian military veterans receive land grants, kleroi, measured in precise aruras, the Egyptian unit of land area. They settle beside Egyptian fellahin, who have worked this soil for millennia. The archive of Zenon, estate manager for the finance minister Apollonius under Ptolemy II, survives on hundreds of papyrus rolls discovered near the town of Philadelphia. These documents reveal a world of meticulous accounting, wheat yields measured to the artabar, irrigation schedules, complaints about lazy workers, negotiations over the price of wine and oil. Greek landlords correspond in Greek. Egyptian tenants petition in Demotic. Translators mediate between them daily. The gymnasium stands at the heart of every Greek community, from Alexandria to Iconium in distant Bactria. It is far more than an athletic facility. Young men train in wrestling, javelin, and running on packed earth grounds surrounded by colonnaded stoas, but they also attend lectures, debate philosophy, and participate in festivals that reinforce their Greek identity. Membership in the gymnasium defines civic belonging. In Egyptian towns, it distinguishes the Greek tax-privileged class from the indigenous population, creating social boundaries as rigid as any wall. Domestic life leaves its traces in terracotta figurines of draped women, bronze mirrors polished to reflection, glass unguentaria holding perfumed oils, and the ubiquitous transport amphorae stamped with the seals of Rhodes, Cnidos, and Tharsos. Households blend traditions. A Greek family in Memphis might worship Serapis, the syncretic deity combining Osiris and Apis with attributes of Zeus, while their Egyptian neighbors adopt Greek naming conventions for legal documents. Women in Ptolemaic Egypt enjoy legal rights unusual in the ancient world. They own property, initiate divorce, conduct business, and appear as parties in court proceedings. Marriage contracts preserved on papyrus specified dowry terms, maintenance obligations, and penalties for abandonment with striking precision. Cleopatra of the Seleucid court, not the famous seventh of that name, but earlier queens and princesses, wield political influence that would astonish classical Athens. Military service remains the backbone of Hellenistic society. Standing armies of professional soldiers garrison fortresses from the Euphrates to Cyrenaica. Macedonian infantry drill with the sarissa in formations their grandfathers would recognize, though the armies increasingly recruit indigenous troops. Galatian mercenaries serve the Seleucids. Nubian archers patrol Upper Egypt. The military camp becomes its own cosmopolitan community. Around 300 before the Common Era, Zeno of Citium, a merchant son from Cyprus, begins teaching in the painted Stoa of Athens. His philosophy, Stoicism, argues that virtue alone constitutes happiness, that the universe operates according to rational divine law, and that all human beings share a common nature transcending nationality. His near contemporary Epicurus, teaching in his garden, offers a different answer, that pleasure, understood as the absence of pain and anxiety, represents the highest good, and that the gods, if they exist, take no interest in human affairs. These two schools provide frameworks for individual meaning in a world grown too vast for the old certainties of the city-state. Religious life reflects the same cosmopolitan blending. The cult of Isis spreads from Egypt across the Mediterranean. Babylonian astrology merges with Greek astronomy to produce horoscopic traditions. At Delos, temples to Egyptian, Syrian, and Greek deities stand within steps of one another. The texture of this world survives in its smallest artifacts. A child's clay rattle shaped like a pig, a tax receipt for a shipment of lentils, a curse tablet scratched in lead and buried at a crossroads. These fragments compose a civilization where Greek language and institutions provide the framework, but daily existence remains stubbornly local, shaped by climate, soil, and the ancient rhythms of sowing and harvest that no conqueror ever truly changes. But the rhythms of sowing and harvest now unfold beneath a darkening shadow from the west. By the late 3rd century before the Common Era, a power unlike any the Hellenistic world has encountered begins to extend its reach across the Adriatic. Rome, having survived Hannibal's devastating invasion of Italy, emerges from the Second Punic War hardened, vengeful, and alert to threats from every direction. Philip V of Macedon provides the provocation. In 215 before the Common Era, he concludes a treaty with Hannibal Barca, while Carthaginian armies still ravage the Italian peninsula. The alliance is more symbolic than strategic. Philip lacks the naval power to transport significant forces to Italy, but Rome does not forget. The First Macedonian War drags on inconclusively from 214 to 205 before the Common Era, fought largely through proxies and skirmishes along the Illyrian coast. Rome, consumed by the existential struggle against Carthage, cannot yet commit full strength eastward. But the grudge is recorded. When Philip begins aggressively expanding into the Aegean and Asia Minor after 205, alarming Rhodes and Pergamon, these smaller states appeal to Rome. The Senate, now free from the Carthaginian threat after Zama, dispatches legions across the Adriatic in 200 before the Common Era. The Second Macedonian War begins. The rolling hills of Thessaly witness the collision of two military systems perfected over centuries. At Cynocephalae, the Dogs' Heads, a ridge of broken, fog-shrouded hills, the armies meet in June of 197 before the Common Era. Philip deploys his Sarissa phalanx, the descendant of the formation that conquered the Persian Empire. Titus Quinctius Flamininus commands Roman legions organized into flexible manipular units. The terrain decides the contest. On uneven ground, the phalanx cannot maintain its lethal cohesion. Gaps open between the rigid files of pikemen. Roman tribunes lead their maniples into these gaps, and legionaries with short swords work inside the Sarissa's reach, where the long pikes become useless. 8,000 Macedonians fall. Philip sues for peace. At the Isthmian Games of 196 before the Common Era, Flamininus makes a theatrical declaration. A herald announces that Rome restores freedom to the Greeks, freedom from Macedonian garrisons, from tribute, from foreign law. The crowd erupts. Yet this freedom exists at Rome's pleasure, a gift that can be revoked. The Seleucid king Antiochus III, styling himself the Great, misreads the moment. He crosses into Europe, occupying Thrace, and welcomes the exiled Hannibal at his court. Rome responds with overwhelming force. At Magnesia in Asia Minor in 190 before the Common Era, a Roman and Pergamene army shatters the Seleucid host. The Treaty of Apamea in 188 strips Antiochus of all territories north of the Taurus Mountains, imposes an indemnity of 15,000 talents, and limits his navy to 10 warships. The Seleucid Empire, already overstretched, begins its long contraction. Macedonia endures under diminished terms. Philip V spends his remaining years rebuilding strength quietly, developing mines, settling populations in depopulated regions. His son Perseus inherits the throne in 179 before the Common Era, and pursues a cautious policy of alliance building among Greek states, resentful of Roman interference. Rome watches with growing suspicion. The Senate declares war again in 171. Perseus fields the last great Macedonian army, nearly 40,000 men, including a phalanx still armed with the Sarissa, cavalry drawn from the old Campanian tradition, and Thracian auxiliaries. For 3 years he holds his own against mediocre Roman commanders, winning engagements and maintaining the loyalty of his troops. The kingdom that Philip II forged 2 centuries earlier musters its final reserves of discipline and pride. But Rome possesses something no Hellenistic kingdom can match: an inexhaustible supply of citizen soldiers and the political will to absorb defeats and return stronger. The confrontation that will end Macedonian independence forever gathers on the coastal plain of Pieria, where the mountains meet the sea. On the 22nd of June, 168 years before the Common Era, the plain south of Pydna shimmers under a late afternoon sun. The Macedonian phalanx advances in its ancient formation, 16 ranks deep, the forest of sarissa pikes tilting forward into a bristling wall of iron points that has terrified enemies for 2 centuries. For a brief, terrible interval, the Roman legionaries of Lucius Aemilius Paulus fall back before this pressure, unable to penetrate the hedge of spears. The phalanx appears invincible. Then the ground betrays it. As the formation pushes forward across broken terrain, gaps open between the rigid blocks of pikemen. Roman maniples, trained to fight in flexible, independent units, pour into these fissures with their short gladius swords. At close quarters, the sarissa becomes useless, too long to wield, too heavy to discard quickly. The slaughter is methodical and swift. Within an hour, 20,000 Macedonians lie dead on the field. 11,000 more surrender. Perseus flees northward to the sanctuary of Samothrace, where he is captured days later. The Antigonid dynasty, which has ruled Macedonia for over a century, ends not with a siege or a negotiation, but with a king dragged in chains through the streets of Rome during Paulus's triumph. The Roman Senate does not annex Macedonia immediately. Instead, it divides the kingdom into 4 autonomous republics, each forbidden from trading or intermarrying with the others. The gold and silver mines of Mount Pangaion are closed. The monarchy that Philip II built and Alexander carried to the edges of the known world is dismembered with administrative precision. Yet even this arrangement proves insufficient. In 149 before the Common Era, a pretender named Andriscus claims to be Perseus's son and briefly reunites the kingdom in revolt. Rome crushes the uprising and in 148 establishes Macedonia as a permanent Roman province, governed by a praetor dispatched from the capital. 2 years later, the destruction spreads south. The Achaean League's defiance of Roman authority provokes a war that culminates in the sack of Corinth in 146. Lucius Mummius orders the ancient city burned. Its treasures, bronzes, paintings, marble sculptures accumulated over centuries, are shipped to Rome or destroyed. The population is enslaved. Greece itself becomes a Roman protectorate, its independence extinguished. The pattern repeats across the Hellenistic East with grinding inevitability. The Seleucid Empire, already fractured by Parthian expansion from the east and internal dynastic wars, shrinks decade by decade until Pompey the Great abolishes what remains in 64 before the Common Era, reorganizing Syria as a Roman province. The great cities of Antioch and Seleucia on the Tigris pass under new masters. Ptolemaic Egypt endures longest, its wealth and geographic isolation providing a buffer against Roman absorption. But dependence on Roman goodwill grows with each succession crisis. Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemaic line, stakes her kingdom's survival on alliances with Julius Caesar and then Mark Antony. The gamble fails at the Battle of Actium in 31 before the Common Era, where Octavian's fleet shatters the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The following summer, Roman soldiers enter Alexandria. Cleopatra takes her own life. Egypt becomes the personal property of the Roman emperor. The Hellenistic world that Alexander's conquests created, 3 centuries of Greek-speaking kingdoms stretching from the Adriatic to the Hindu Kush, passes entirely under Roman dominion. In former Macedonian palaces, Roman governors now sit. The pebble mosaics of Pella gather dust beneath administrative offices. The tombs at Aigai, sealed with their golden larnaces and painted frescoes, sink into the earth and memory. Yet the civilization these kingdoms carried does not perish. It transforms, flowing into Roman culture like a tributary into a greater river, carrying with it the language, the philosophy, the science, and the restless ambition of a mountain people who once dared to remake the world. That tributary flows with extraordinary force. Within a generation of Rome's final absorption of the Hellenistic kingdoms, the conquerors find themselves conquered by the culture they have swallowed. Koine Greek, the common tongue that Alexander's armies carried from the Nile to the Indus, becomes the administrative and intellectual language of the entire Roman East. Roman senators send their sons to study philosophy in Athens, rhetoric in Rhodes, medicine in Pergamon. When the authors of the New Testament set down the Gospels and epistles that will reshape human spiritual history, they write not in Aramaic, not in Latin, but in this same Koine Greek, the language of a Macedonian empire that had ceased to exist politically, yet lives on in every syllable. Roman emperors study Alexander with obsessive intensity. Julius Caesar weeps before a statue of the conqueror in Gades, lamenting that at the same age Alexander had already subdued the world. Augustus keeps a signet ring carved with Alexander's likeness. Trajan stands at the Persian Gulf and gazes eastward, consciously retracing the Macedonians' path. The very concept of universal empire, one sovereign ruling diverse peoples under a single civilizing vision, passes directly from the Argead model through Roman imperial ideology and onward into the political imagination of Europe for 2 millennia. The knowledge preserved in Hellenistic libraries survives Rome's own decline through a remarkable chain of transmission. Arab scholars of the 8th and 9th centuries translate Euclid, Archimedes, Aristotle, and Ptolemy's astronomical works from Greek into Arabic, preserving and extending Hellenistic science during the Islamic Golden Age. The Alexander Romance, a fictionalized account of the conqueror's life composed in Ptolemaic Alexandria, spreads across 30 languages: Persian, Syriac, Ethiopian, Malay, Old French, making Alexander a universal hero from Iceland to Indonesia. In medieval Islamic tradition, he becomes Dul-Qarnayn, the 2-horned one, a righteous king who journeys to the ends of the earth. Renaissance Europe rediscovers these streams of knowledge flowing back from Arabic translation into Latin, and with them the Hellenistic conviction that human reason can measure the cosmos. The architectural proportions of Hellenistic temples reappear in Palladian villas. The emotional intensity of Hellenistic sculpture, that anguished Laocoon unearthed in Rome in 1506, electrifies Michelangelo and reshapes Western art. Then, on a November afternoon in 1977, the archaeologist Manolis Andronikos lifts a marble slab at the Great Tumulus near the village of Vergina in northern Greece. Beneath the earth, undisturbed for 23 centuries, lies a vaulted Macedonian tomb. Inside, a golden larnax weighing 11 kilograms bears the 16-pointed vagina sun on its lid. Within it rest cremated bones that forensic analysis attributes to Philip II, the man who forged the instrument his son would wield to reshape civilization. Nearby, painted frescoes of a royal hunt glow with colors as vivid as the day they were applied. An oak wreath crown of pure gold, its leaves so delicate they tremble at a breath, rests where mourners placed it over 2 millennia before. The ruins of Pella catch the last amber light of a winter afternoon. Rain pools in the pebble mosaics where Dionysus once rode his leopard in tiny stones of black and white. Wild grasses push through the foundations of the palace where Alexander was born. At Dion, beneath Mount Olympus, the sacred springs still flow past the remains of temples where Macedonian kings sacrificed before marching to war. These stones and silences hold the memory of a people who emerged from mountain obscurity, unified a fractured peninsula, overthrew the greatest empire of their age, and scattered the seeds of a civilization that still shapes how humanity thinks, governs, builds, and dreams. From a highland kingdom of shepherds and warriors to the language of scripture, the geometry of reason, and the enduring dream of a world made one, Macedonia's echo has never fallen silent. Thank you for journeying through this complete story of Macedonia and the world it created. If these travels through history have stirred something in you, consider subscribing so you will not miss the next civilization we bring to life together.